This is the land where Henry Church and his family made their home in 1834. It was once the land of the Iroquois, lakes, rivers, and streams, waterfalls that cascaded into pools teeming with fish. It was a land of forests that stretched as far as the eye could see. Wildlife was abundant, supporting the Native Americans, and by the 1700s, the French, who laid claim to the land. In the 1740s, the plentiful wildlife in the region set the stage for the trading post of French trapper Francois Chagrin. He apparently was held in such high regard that the river was named after him, Rivière Chagrin, and shown that way on a map from 1778 created by Thomas Hutchins. The names Chagrin River and later Chagrin Falls may have been derived from Chagrin's name. France's control of the territory ended with the British victory in the French and Indian War. Long before, in King Charles II's colonial charters, England had divided the land in the west among the coastal colonies. However, Britain's claim to any of the colonies came to an end in the American Revolution. A second victory by the Americans over Britain in the War of 1812 was key to the westward migration of pioneers, and among them were Noah Graves and his wife Minerva. They are credited with beginning the settlement at Chagrin Falls. According to one story, Graves, having stumbled on the high falls and being impressed with the potential power of the river, purchased 210 acres in 1833. Graves told his good friend Henry Church about the land. At the time, Henry and his wife Clarissa lived in Deerfield, Massachusetts, with daughters Jerusha, 7 years old, and newborn Jane. Church was a blacksmith, something every town needed at the time. In the spring of 1834, Henry visited the land with the high falls and decided that he and his growing family could make a go of it in Chagrin. A diary written by Henry's son, Austin, recounts his father's memory of the family's trip in 1834.
At that time, there was no Chagrin. Only the river held that name. Our folks were 21 days on the way, plodding along up the Erie Canal at Buffalo, taking a steamer for Cleveland.
The trip on the Erie Canal covered 363 miles from the Hudson River in Albany to Buffalo and took about 9 days. Passenger rates were about a penny a mile. A steamer from Buffalo to Cleveland lasted 20 to 24 hours. Cabin fare with meals was $6. Steerage or deck passage was $2.50. Upon arriving in Cleveland, the family hired a team to take them the rest of the way.
Our folks arrived at their destination in Chagrin October 4th, 1834, and the next morning there was 2 inches of snow on the ground.
A house that was supposed to have been built for the Church family arrival was not, so they had to begin living in a barn. Within a year, a surprising number of settlers were confident that the river would provide the power and the forests would provide the building material so that they could make a successful life in Chagrin. Some of the early arrivals eventually moved on. However, many stayed and would be integral to the shaping of the community. By 1836, the road system had grown, connecting the high falls with other early settlements and allowing Chagrin to become a center for goods and services. In 1837, L.D. Williams, an active Methodist, abolitionist, and schoolteacher, moved to Chagrin, and a year later wrote of the settlement.
This place is new. The people are far from being wealthy and the times are hard. The place is growing, possesses natural advantages, and is very healthy.
The community was thriving, and by 1843, the Chagrin River was providing power for 9 mills, and the mills were providing everything from axes to flour to paper to woolens to metal goods and woodenware. The Farmers and Mechanics Journal provided an impressive list of businesses that called Chagrin Falls home. This print from a woodcut by Jehu Brainerd shows how Chagrin had grown by 1847. By that time, Asbury Seminary Select School was in operation, but it was not the first school in Chagrin. Thanks to drawings by Henry Church Jr., we know of the early one-room schoolhouses. And thanks to Henry's brother Austin, we have stories, including one about the Cottage Street School and the teacher.
This Mr. Ives was an oldish man, and I remember one day he wanted to leave the school for a few minutes, and he spoke to one of the older scholars, Foster, to take charge of the school. Foster went out onto the floor for business, but kept his eye on Ives through the window. As soon as the old man was out of sight, Foster says, "School is dismissed." When the teacher came back, not a soul was in the house nor in sight.
In the early years, Henry Church served as a justice of the peace in the area, presiding over disputes involving debtors and creditors and occasional assaults or theft. During the decade of the 1840s, part of Geauga County was annexed into Cuyahoga County, unifying the settlement. The village became incorporated with all of the accompanying benefits, and a Chagrin Falls Township was formed. In the 1850s, the growth of the village continued, as shown in the first official survey in 1858. However, division in the country had also grown over the issue of slavery. By this time, Church had moved his family from one side of the river to the other and into this house on West Orange Street, where Henry and his wife Clarissa would spend the rest of their lives. This house was part of the Underground Railroad, where runaway slaves could safely stay on their way to freedom in Canada. This was done at great risk because of the fugitive slave law. Violating it, as the churches did, exposed them to imprisonment and fines. Austin Church remembers sheltering the visitors who escaped from the South.
As long ago as I can remember, runaway slaves were brought to our house, nearly always in the nighttime, and our folks would care for them through the day. Then some others would take them on out to Cleveland, put them aboard of a boat, and direct them to Canada.
Austin also recalls a letter that his father wrote to the creator of the Fugitive Slave Act, slaveholder Senator Henry Clay of Kentucky, saying that
his slave was now in Canada, that he stayed at my house one day and told who he was, and he, father, forgot to take steps to return him to Kentucky and Mr. Clay.
Jane Church, in her private journal, wrote,
"A fugitive from Richmond, Virginia, by the name of Clark, is staying here tonight. Oh, God! A human being running away to get his freedom in this boasted land of the free? What consistency! Heaven save us!"
In 1859, after John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry and the hanging of the abolitionist for his action, Jane wrote in her journal,
"John Brown's death will do more toward liberating the slave than any event that has ever transpired in this country before."
The beginning of the Civil War was only 16 months away. In April of 1861, shortly after the first shots of the war were fired, the township enlisted 55 men. Austin Church served twice during the war, once as a volunteer member of a group called the Squirrel Hunters who went to Cincinnati to guard against a possible invasion of Ohio. After finishing his second tour of duty in 1864, for which he was paid as a substitute by a wealthy family, Austin returned home with what was called camp fever. He survived, but his younger sister Flora contracted the fever and died. In this picture, the family is holding a picture of Flora after her passing. All of the living members of the family at that time are shown in this photograph. Henry Church Sr. and his wife Clarissa both passed away in Chagrin in 1878 and are buried at Evergreen Hills Cemetery on South Franklin Street. Their eldest daughter, Jerusha, born in 1826, married Timothy Bliss at the age of 16. They moved back east, but Bliss died young, and Jerusha later married Henry Pepper in 1847. Jerusha passed away in 1910. All of the rest of the church children, except for Henry Jr., eventually moved to Redlands, California, including Jane, who was born in 1833. She was a talented seamstress and dressmaker and a staunch abolitionist. She played a major role on the home front in Chagrin during the Civil War, serving as secretary and later president of the Soldiers' Aid Society, a group that would collect and send necessities to the soldiers and provide financial aid to their needy families at home. After the war, Jane spearheaded an effort to raise $1,350 to erect this monument to honor 21 Chagrin residents who lost their lives during the war. The village gave her this silver-plated water pitcher, goblets, and tray to show its appreciation for her efforts. Every Memorial Day, the monument is still the site where the Gettysburg Address is recited by a Chagrin Falls student. Jane passed away in Redlands in 1917, but she is buried in Chagrin near the monument she helped build. Eldest son Henry Jr., born in 1836, married Martha Preble and became the best known of the church family, not because of the blacksmithing he learned from his father, but because of his self-taught folk art. At his blacksmith shop next to his home on the corner of South Franklin and East Washington Streets, Henry crafted paintings and stone and metal sculptures. He sold some of his works on site and some at Church's Art Museum at Geauga Lake Park. His most famous work, once called Squaw Rock but now Henry Church Rock, still attracts visitors who make the trek to its site overlooking the Chagrin River in Metropolitan Park. Many experts have called it a masterful work. His painting, known as the Monkey Picture, is part of the collection at the Abby Aldrich Rockefeller Folk Art Museum in Williamsburg, Virginia. He forged the weather vane that still sits atop Township Hall, and his lion and lamb carving, which was originally intended as a gift to the village and was once featured in the courtyard of the Cleveland Museum of Art, now resides in Evergreen Hills Cemetery as his tombstone. Henry Jr. lived most of his life in Chagrin and died there in 1908. Austin, born in 1838, was married to Maria Waterman. Besides serving in the Civil War and as one of the blacksmiths in town, he was elected to various town offices. In his journal, he joked about the election of 1872.
The foolish people of Chagrin Falls elected me at last April election town clerk for this year. Reasons obvious: superior qualifications for doing town drudgery, sweeping town hall.
Austin also served in other positions and as a member of the school board for years. But possibly his greatest contribution was his journal, which documents the rich history of the town and tells fascinating stories of its residents that would have otherwise been lost. Austin died in 1916 and is buried in Chagrin. Royal Church, born in 1841, was married to Blendina Mills. Like his brothers, he served Chagrin as a blacksmith, in business together with Austin. He was also in the town band with both of his brothers and would often show his playful side. Royal died in 1928. Almerin Church was the next born son, born in 1846, but died less than 3 years later. Clara, or Cal as she was called by the family, was born in 1849 and was a school teacher in Chagrin for several years. In 1877, Clara married Frank Hunt, a carpenter and joiner who was a co-inventor of the Stranahan folding boat, which was manufactured in Chagrin and sold around the world. Clara and Frank moved to Redlands, California, where Clara's sister Jane would live with them on land that featured an orange grove. Clara passed away there in 1934. Flora, born in 1851, was only 12 years old when she died in October of 1864. Many in the next generation moved away from Chagrin, but there were also many who stayed and continued to contribute to the fabric of the community. Henry Jr.'s son Austin was a photography enthusiast who provided many of the photographs we have as a visual record of the village. He was also a co-founder of Brewster & Church Department Store, a mainstay of shopping in Chagrin for decades. His cousin John Church helped install the first telephone lines in Chagrin, and later became mayor and president of the Chagrin Falls Banking Company. After settling Chagrin, Henry Church Sr. used to say he wanted to live till a railroad came into town and until slavery was done away. He had his desires answered. His children and their children saw much more come to pass through the years. However, the Church family was one of many families who have helped shape Chagrin Falls into the community that it is today.